In this video, we will look at the radio button control for Windows Form applications. The radio button is typically used in a group with other radio buttons, and a radio button allows the user to select a single selection from a set of options. So when you have a group of radio buttons together, when one radio button is selected, all of the others in the group are unselected. So only one radio button option in a group can ever be selected. Some common properties of the radio button are very similar to the checkbox. The text property displays a string of text or contains a string that displays the text that is next to the radio button. The checked property is a Boolean property that tells whether the radio button is selected or not. The value true means the checked value being true means that the radio button is selected. The enabled property is a Boolean property that tells whether the radio button can be interacted with or not. The visible property is a Boolean property that tells whether the radio button is shown or not. Some helpful methods that might be used with the radio button are the show and hide method, which sets the visible property to false and true. And the default event for the radio button, similarly to the checkbox, is the check changed event. When the radio button's state changes from either selected to not selected or from not selected to selected, the check changed event will trigger, and we will see how we can use that. All right, let's look at some examples. So here I have my form. In the Common Controls tab in my toolbox, I can come down and find a radio button control. And I'm going to go ahead and drag 3 of these radio buttons onto my form. And then let's go ahead and create a button. And this button is going to be a test button. And then I will have a rich text box which will let me know what radio button has been selected. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is register a click event handler for my test button. And what I want to do is when I click on this button, I want to check to see which of these radio buttons is selected. So I'm going to go over, select my button, add a click event handler. I'm going to call this test radio buttons. And let's write some code here. Well, first thing I'm going to do is clear out whatever was previously entered into the rich text box. And I'm going to say if radio button 1's checked property is true, that means the radio button 1 is checked. So I can say my rich text box text value is equal to radio button 1 checked, or is checked. Let's say is selected, because this is not a text box. And instead of setting it directly into the text property, although for radio buttons this would be fine, I'm going to use the append text method to prove that we can't ever have more than one radio button selected at a time. Alright, now I'm just going to copy this logic for each of the other radio buttons. So we're going to see if radio button 2 is checked, then I'm going to append to rich text box 1 that radio button 2 is selected. If radio button 3 is checked, we don't have multiple check boxes or text boxes, I'm going to select or print that radio button 3 is selected. So in 3 independent if statements that are checking to see if the checked property of the radio button is true. So let's test this out. So we'll run our application, and we see here that radio button 1 is selected by default, and we'll talk about that in a moment. When I click on radio button 2, what happens is radio button 1 becomes unselected, and when I click on radio button 3 becomes unselected. So I can only ever select one option at a time. So that's what radio buttons are used for. And if I test it, I can see that, well, radio button 3 was selected, now 2 is selected, now 1 is selected, but there's no way that I'm ever going to get all of these radio buttons selected. Okay? All right. let's see, where can we go next? Let's look at the check changed event for a radio button. So I'm going to go to my radio button 3, and the default event associated with a radio button is the check changed event. And so I'm going to double click on my radio button 3 here, and I've registered a check changed event for radio button 3. Now every time the state changes from checked to not checked, this event is going to trigger. So let's write some code inside here. I'm going to say if the radio button 3 checked property is true, then I'm going to set to my rich text box, I'm going to say radio button 3 was just selected. And if it's not, I'm going to say that radio button 3 was just unselected. And let's see what happens here. So when the checked state of my radio button changes from either checked to unchecked or unchecked to checked, this event is going to trigger, and we should print something to the rich text box. So let's check this out. So I can use my test button to test all 3 radio buttons at any time. But watch what happens when I select my radio button 3. The text changed event triggered, and it shows me that radio button 3 was just selected. Now when I go back and change radio button 1, radio button 3 was unselected behind the scenes, and that unselection triggered my check changed event handler. So even when I am manually selecting radio button 3 and generate that check changed event on radio button 3, or selecting another radio button that is unselecting it for me, both of those events cause the check changed event to trigger on radio button 3. So it's selected, unselected. Alright, one last thing I want to show you with radio buttons are what happens if you want to have several groups of radio buttons and you want to keep the selections independent from one another. Well, we will go into container classes at a different, in a later video, I hope. But let's say I have some type of container control in which I put their own set of radio buttons. So I'm putting a radio button 4 and 5 inside this group box container. Well, the radio buttons 1, 2, and 3 are inside the form container. The form object itself is a container class. It contains other controls. And let's run this and check it out for a moment. So here I can select radio button 1, 2, and 3. They're independent, or they are a group tied together. But when I go up here to select radio button 4, 4 and 5 are now in their own group. So if I select 4, or I select 4, 5 becomes unselected and vice versa. So if you want several groups of radio buttons where each radio button group is its own kind of group of selections, you can isolate sets of radio buttons from one another by putting those radio buttons inside some type of container. Okay, now the last thing I want to show you is when I clicked start here, notice my radio button 4 and 5, one of them wasn't selected by default. Often when you use radio buttons, you want to ensure that at least one button is selected by default. So to make that happen, what you can do is you can select one of the radio buttons in your selection, in your set, and go to the events or the properties tab, find the checked property, and give one of them set the checked property to true by default. Now in my radio button 1, 2, and 3 set, something was going on behind the scenes that was making one of them set by default. But to guarantee one is going to be set by default, I'm going to take one of my 3 here. How about radio button 2? Find the checked property and set it to true. So this way I'm guaranteeing that my form is going to, when my form is launched, I'm going to have at least one option from each group set by default. Now radio button 1 took over control. So somewhere behind the scenes, my radio button 1 is being initialized to true. let's see, radio button 1's checked property is false. Let me go to my designer view here. What's going on here? Radio button 1. 2. So my radio button 1's checked property is true. Well, this is a unexpected event in this video. I don't know quite what's going on. If I find out, I will put a comment in the video section. But I hope this gives you an idea of how to use radio buttons.